Okay, all right, we are going to make a start. I am going to share my slides. Feel free to let people in during the session because I may miss that while presenting. Let me share my screen and full thingy. Can I just have a thumbs up to make sure that, perfect, thank you so much. Thanks, Dylan. Okay, so today is going to be all around what we can do. So the overall theme of this series was moving from intent to action. So that's going to be really the focus of today. Just because I think we have one or two new faces, but I'm going to take 2 minutes to really quickly show you a bit about me, because this is important, I think, to understand where I'm coming from. We'll talk about that later also, how important that is for inclusiveness in learning. So promise you to be really quick. My background is an international corporate career. I've been in this space of learning and development globally for the last 20 years or so. But the reason why we're here together is because I'm also an academic and a researcher. And for the past decade or so, I've been looking at inclusiveness in learning, which was also the topic of my dissertation. The reason why I got into this space is very personal. This is our son with Down syndrome. He's 21, and for the last 21 years, I had conversations around including him in education systems. About 10 years ago, I figured out that I did not have the skills or the knowledge to have these conversations with school boards, etc., given my economics background. So I time to upskill and reskill, did a master's on critical issues in education, which discussed who is included, who can access our education system, who's not included. And it struck me how little of these questions we ask, in my experience, we ask in adult learning and development in companies and organizations. So that was the start of me getting into this field, and it's never left me since. This is my son with his older brother, and these are my two daughters. And they unfortunately experience very different lived experiences because of their ethnicity. And my hope in this work is that when they get to training and adult learning in companies and organizations, all these programs are super inclusive and all learners have an equitable chance to be successful. Some of my publications, they're on my website, feel free to access them. And this is what I do. So I work with learning and development teams to see how we can make learning and development programs more inclusive. With that, the purpose of the session of today is very practical. I'm going to suggest to you 3 core questions that you can ask yourself to support more inclusive learning and development. We're going to talk about reflexivity and how to do that. I'm going to share loads of practical tips and ideas, and maybe you're open to sharing some of your own. See if we can learn together. And I'm going to share with you a set of inclusive learning survey questions that Will Thalheimer and I have developed, freely available, that you can use as well in this work. So just to repeat, inclusive learning is that our learning programs work successfully for all our learners, irrespective of categories such as gender, race, ethnicity, disability, class, etc. So that's the definition of inclusive learning and that I'm working from. Now, what I've learned over the past many years, and this is actually, I continue to come back to 3 core questions that we need to ask ourselves to support the inclusiveness of our learning. And these 3 questions are, firstly, who has access to our programs? Because if people don't have access, they're not going to be able to learn optimally. So who has access is a really, really important question to ask ourselves in terms of inclusiveness. But it's not just access. Inclusiveness is more than having access. The other big question is whose realities are reflected in the programs that we design and that we facilitate. And I'm going to actually talk about all these three questions in a bit more detail later on. But whose realities are reflected? This includes whose knowledge is reflected and respected. So this is a big bucket. And the final question is, who benefits most from our programs? And do we know? Do we measure the inclusiveness? How can we measure the inclusiveness? So I'm going to discuss these three questions in a little bit more detail, and then also share some practical tips and recommendations on how to do that. Who has access? Well, last week we already shared some ideas and some elements of accessibility in learning and development that we can consider. And this is the list that we came up with. So about the cost, we know, for example, costs of executive programs or MBA programs are really increasing the inequality of traditionally excluded groups in these programs. Location, is the location of a program safe? Is it accessible via public transport for people who don't have their own cars? Duration of programs, multiple day programs can be amazing, but they can also be a challenge for people who have care responsibilities. Entry requirements, not typically, I have to say, but they risk reinforcing those groups who traditionally participate in these programs. So they almost confirm what was done in the past. So that's a tricky one sometimes in terms of accessibility. When the line manager is required to give access or to suggest who can participate in programs, there's also a risk, we know from literature and from research, that bias can be involved. For example, studies show that line managers, both men and women, have a tendency to evaluate the career ambitions of women lower than they are in reality and versus their male colleagues. So that's an area where accessibility can be at risk. Technology, I mean, there's an amazing and growing amount of resources on how technology and digital platforms can be creating access issues for all learners, but specifically for learners with a disability. And again, there is fantastic resources on that nowadays. Some activities are not accessible, especially if you are, for example, if you have either a disability, if you're neurodivergent, really lots of considerations there. And evaluations, we know, especially in education, higher level education can be creating issues with access. So lots of areas. Now, what is a practical suggestion that I would like to share with you? And that's the question, ask what if. And this question means that when you're designing or when you're thinking in advance in terms of your programs, ask yourself, what if one of my learners is/has neurodivergent or deaf or hard of hearing, or blind or low vision or colorblind, or has a speech impairment, or is in a wheelchair, or has care responsibilities, or English, for example, if it's a global program, English is not their native language. So you can ask yourself before whether if one of your learners is or has one of these characteristics, and maybe you have others, is that person then still being able to optimally learn in your program? Any thoughts about this when you see this suggestion? I will have a look at my chat as well. Sorry about that. Does it make sense to ask these questions before or when you're designing a program?
It definitely makes sense, but for me, the big question is, how do you cover everyone? And gosh, you think I'd hate to forget about the person who's got care responsibilities, for example, but yeah, it's intimidating, that list, because you're going, how can I cover everyone?
Yeah. I see what you mean. So I'm just going to ask before I respond, let me see what Mayan, do you want to, I will come back to your question. I'm just curious to see if Mayan is going to respond to your question or has a different question. Different question? Okay. All right. Well, what I can say, Vic, is that once you get into this mode and once you start kind of peeling off, what does it mean if I have a neurodivergent learner in my team? It becomes almost like a second nature. You know what you need to look for, you know and you may not get it 100% right. And that's okay. We don't, and as I say in the end, this is about progress, not perfection. But it does become something that you start to do automatically in addition to all the other great learning science that's out there. So I understand what you say, it's intimidating, but it's something that we need to kind of get into our system so it's not intimidating anymore. It becomes kind of of course we check our PowerPoints on black and white screen. So we know how this is for colorblind. It's just something that we're going to do automatically. Does that make sense? And then if you start with something and you miss out, I mean, this is really, as I say at the end, this is about starting with this work in ways that are possible for you. But starting with if I think is could really be helpful in that sense. Yeah, Mayan.
My question is, so if I understand you correctly, is that you always propose that we would design thinking about these possibilities, but not that we actually reach out and encourage people to self-disclose, if I'm following you.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So what you do is, because that I have another practical tip in the next slide, but this is more around thinking ahead, especially if you're working on global programs or large companies. The likelihood that you have learners who are experiencing some of these is quite big. So the question is if you really need to ask whether there are people in your group of learners who who are or who have who whatever. I mean, self-disclosing I think is a very tricky one to ask people, so I would stay away from that. So this is really designing with these kind of situations in your head is my recommendation.
Thank you.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Having said that, this is a question I sometimes ask if I have a smaller group of learners. I know who's in my group. It's a program that I organize myself. And I give the opportunity for my learners to share with me if they need anything to be able to optimally participate and learn during the workshop training course. And this information will be treated confidential. Now, in my experience, maybe you have learners who don't have any requests, but they still really like you asking the question. And it's also it doesn't have to be something similar to what was on the last slide, but it can also be something around, I need to pick up one, or I need to pick up a family member at a certain time, or I need to check in with this person who I'm caring for. It can be different levels of support that your learners need. And asking this question doesn't, from my perspective, doesn't force people to self-disclose, but it opens up the space for people to share with you if they have something that they want you to consider during the training. So my experience with asking this question is very positive, and it's really helped me it's sometimes helped me to think about things that I'm really pleased with to know up front instead of during the program. Okay. So some practical tips. Now there is UDL, Universal Design of Learning, that suggests to always have two formats of the same thing. So if you have a video, you also have a PDF. If you have chat, you also have the opportunity to speak up. So that's another, I didn't put it on the slide, but that's another thing that you can keep in the back of your mind in terms of practical tips, is always have twos of your interaction modus. Okay, moving on in the interest of time. The second one, whose realities are reflected? Whose knowledge do we incorporate? And this is where we kind of refer back to our conversation last week when we talked about the default learner, and where our programs sometimes risk being focused on that kind of standardized group that is often the historically dominant group in a certain industry or in a certain function or role. And then it sometimes risks becoming this one-size-fits-all 5 steps of negotiations, the circle of leadership, the triangle of motivation, I don't know, where all these models then become kind of a truth, but it's very much based on a certain way of seeing and experiencing the world. So one of the things that is important in this field is this conversation about realities and whose realities we reflect, I think, starts with us as learning and development professionals. And we do a lot of reflection in learning and development. So we actually, we think about, okay, we reflect on how did the program work, what were the benefits. We ask our participants to reflect on what they did and how that worked and what the impact was, etc., etc. But reflexivity means something different. It means that we examine our own how our own experiences, opportunities, values, and assumptions influence the way we design and facilitate our programs, and in turn, how these programs might benefit some learners more than others. And I think this is important, and because we have our positionality. I shared with you my positionality at the beginning, where I'm coming from, which impacts the way that I see the world. And I have many privileges in this world that may influence how I design my program and things I take for granted that my learners are able to do or see, which may or may not be true. So some of the questions that we could ask ourselves are, starting with, well, how might the realities and experiences of my diverse learners differ from my own, considering factors such as gender, ethnicity, class, language, age, disability? And then, in what ways do my own opportunities, values, and assumptions influence the programs and tools I design and facilitate? Am I having that default learner perspective based on my own experiences, or does that include diverse realities and experiences? When I base my programs mostly on my own experiences and values and assumptions, am I excluding any learners and their knowledge and experiences? Very important. Finally, how can I learn about the different realities of my learners that I may not personally experience? So how do I do that? How can I access that? So when you look at these questions, what are your thoughts? You can either write in chat or put up your mic or... Yeah, Laurie.
Yeah, just more of a question. Do you have just a basic example of how this might play out and how it could be sort of course corrected? Where are you seeing this happen?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Yeah, we need to make this real, right? This conversation today. So thank you for doing that. Okay, so where I see that happening, for example, is in actually I see it happening in many learning and development programs. probably unfortunately. So I see it, for example, in negotiations training. I have an example about the negotiation training in a minute, but where we have the 5 steps of negotiations or 6 steps, but it's fairly standardized in terms of how we're all supposed to negotiate. But many of these programs do not consider that if you're, for example, if you're a member of a minority group who typically negotiates, what is expected from you can be very different from what's being said in the training, making it very specific. So when I was negotiating, I was in a commercial role. When I was negotiating, I often had this tricky thing of one being evaluated on negotiation skills and behaviors, but then also my gender roles. And that was tough because if I was really assertive, that actually conflicted with the stereotypical gender role that people would put on me. But when I was doing gender's typical behaviors, then that was conflicting what people would say were really good negotiations. Now that conflict was seldomly discussed in negotiation courses or programs. So these negotiation programs were written from the perspective of people who don't experience gender barriers or barriers because of their race, ethnicity, or because of maybe neurodiversity, who may approach communications or negotiations differently. So it's very standardized. Another quick example that comes to mind every time I see this is when we talk about autonomy. Autonomy comes up as being really important, for example, in leadership programs. But we know that being autonomous is more difficult if you're part of a minority group than if you're part of the traditionally dominant group. So the terms, the frameworks that we use are sometimes, often, be careful, used as if they're neutral. But they're not, because they work differently dependent on identity, background. Does that make sense, Laurie? Is that a practical example?
Yeah, it does. And I think, it brings to mind, like if you're coming from a very hierarchical society where these things might be difficult as well, specifically in the example that you used. So thanks for that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's almost, I'm just trying to think this through, and I'm really grateful for your question, but it's almost as if in programs we assume that there are realities where these systemic barriers based on gender, ethnicity, disabilities don't exist, that's a red flag for me. That would be a red flag. Because that assumes that none of your learners is facing that. And I don't have a lot of experience with those kind of environments. So that for me is something to consider, I guess. But we have some help these days, and that's called AI. So it goes straight through. Anyway, so what I did was I thought, okay, fine, let's see if AI can be a help in terms of understanding what some of these structural barriers are. So I designed this prompt. And I always do think hard, because in these difficult topics, that's what my AI system needs. And in this example, I say, okay, I'm designing a negotiation course for a sales team in a large multinational company. I want to ensure that the course is inclusive, reflects the realities and barriers that my diverse participants may face when negotiating with clients. I asked it analyze how systemic barriers related to sexism, racism, ageism, all the isms that we discussed last time may show up. For each ism, provide an explanation of the systemic barrier, cite credible sources, focus on structural or institutional factors. We discussed this last time, and this is not about personal bias. And the last one, I'll show you an example I think is important. Ensure the analysis does not reinforce stereotypes, such as women or older workers prefer collaborative styles of negotiation, unless you have credible evidence. And I'll show you why that last one is important. So AI can be a tool to answer some of the questions that we asked before. Now, let me show you why I added that last statement. When I didn't, this is one of the things that it turned up, that it gave me. It says success metrics in negotiations reward competitive tactics over collaborative approaches, disadvantaging women who adopt relational strategies. Now, that's a stereotype. It's a stereotype to think that women prefer collaborative approaches. There is enough evidence to suggest that's not the case. However, what is true is that women who show assertive behavior may face penalties because it contradicts with gender stereotypical roles. So that's why I added the last part of the prompt to make sure that at least to some extent already AI is critical on some of these biases and stereotypes that are part of the database, unfortunately. So just be really critical when you use AI for this kind of questions. Some of the output, we're not going to go through this, but basically, I mean, and there were some really solid things in there in terms of, for all the isms, it gave me some ideas around, how negotiations can privilege masculine coded behaviors, because there's often a lack of transparency. You end up with gendered expectations. And then it gives some really good sources on gendered standards in negotiations. And it could do this for sexism, for class, for heterosexism, all the isms. So really good resource to consider. But again, be really careful about it spitting out stereotypical assumptions about this group is this group is that. Just make sure you challenge that. So I hope this is another practical tip in terms of being reflexive and having this conversation using AI to be reflexive. The third one, the third bucket, who benefits most? Now, how can we know this? This is where learner survey questions can really help. What we did was Will Thalheimer and myself, and Will is kind of a guru on learner survey questions. We designed survey questions that can help us to ask our learners on the level of inclusiveness of our programs. So we designed questions, we improved them 20 plus times. We got input and feedback from experts, both academic as well as professionals. We ran several pilots across the globe, in global programs, and then in the UK and in the US. We used Think Aloud protocols. I don't think we have time to go, well, maybe we have, but this is a protocol that I would recommend if you go and pilot the questions to use that as well. We presented at a scientific conference in terms of our questions. So Will, as I said, is for me is a guru on learner surveys and how to make learner surveys more impactful and more useful. And the 5 questions that we designed are on accessibility, representation, language, belonging, and real life barriers too. So to what extent did the real life barriers were your real life barriers discussed in the program? So this is about realities, right? This is about realities being reflected in the program. This is the example of the question on accessibility. Now, Will's approach to questions is he says this Likert 1 to 5 is not giving us any information. It's not helpful. We don't know if 3.5 is good and 3.7 is really good, or people just respond 4 and it doesn't really help us. So the design that he has is that there are distinctive answer options that learners have to select from, and you can select more than one. This is the example on accessibility. How well did the design and organization of the learning program enable you to fully participate? And then there's different answer options that the learners can choose from. And I was super pleased with this because one of the pilots we did was we wrote an academic paper on this pilot, and it was published a couple of November. Yeah, so it was September. It was accepted. It's now published, and it's open access, which means it's available for everybody if you want to access it. And you can also read in this paper the research on why these 5 topics. Why did we do this case study, what we learned. So there's a lot of information in here that you can use. Just 3 big buckets of what we learned from this study and from the pilot. 1, the questions help to give a voice to those often overlooked in learning. This is just one of the quotes. After actually hopping onto the Zoom training call, we realized pretty quickly that there were no captions enabled. For the deaf and hard of hearing community, it can be very difficult to hear someone speak. Adam in this is a pseudonym, so it's not his real name. Terry shared, again a pseudonym, there was definitely a language barrier issue with some people. Learners requested that they not join the breakout rooms because they're not very comfortable with their English as not their native language. And this is something I see a lot in my research, is the challenge with breakout rooms and people having to speak up. And actually having this insight enabled the company that we did this research with to change the way that they set up the breakout room. So that was really helpful. The other result was that the question helped uncover issues with this current neutral default learner approach to training. The conversation that we had before in terms of whose realities are you reflecting. And because we have that question in there in terms of real life barriers, whether you see your reality reflected, Terry fed back, well, I don't believe that it did a great job, and it is the program. It did a great job in preparing me to deal with some of the other factors such as gender, race, ethnicity, and being a female in a mostly male-dominated role. It wasn't necessarily dealing with who I am as a person presenting myself. So Terry in her interview shared that, yeah, it was all, 5 steps, 6 steps, triangle, circles. But what I am facing in my role in the topic of the training wasn't discussed. So later on, she discussed how that impacted the transfer of the learning. And the last one, and I think this is really important and part of why Will Valheimer's questions are so helpful, is using these questions is actually nudging inclusive approaches. And it almost mirrors what we said at the beginning when we talked, for example, about access. Knowing that these questions are going to be asked in the end may actually make us and maybe our teams or our colleagues more conscious of the fact that, hey, we need to really pay attention to accessibility because this is something that is, people find important in this program. And for example, here, Lark responded, being a white woman, I've been represented as far as my group goes. I definitely need to pay more attention to that I'm being a voice for minority groups and that they're being represented, but it's not something that I paid attention to in this class. And Mia said, it would have maybe changed my perspective on the training, knowing about the questions prior. So this is where the questions can actually help us become aware and nudge us towards inclusive approaches. This is the website Will and I designed for these questions. So they're freely available, inclusivelearningsurvey.org, and all the information, all the information is there about what we did, how to use the questions, the learner survey, the recommendations that we have in terms of how to use the questions. And also, if you want to sign up, because we have a really neat community of people who are using the questions, and we share our learnings once every 3 months, we get together and we discuss. So there's also the option to become part of that little community. So free resource for you to use. With all of this, so many ideas in terms of access and accessibility and asking what if, and then talk about the different realities, asking ourselves reflexive questions, maybe using AI, and then maybe evaluating and understanding who benefits most. It's quite a lot. So sometimes I'm getting the question, where do I start with all of this? And my take on that is as follows. This is, for me, is really about progress over perfection. Make an effort, try to make a difference. I think the fact that we have many programs out there that are not inclusive yet is, we know that's the case. That's not necessarily the biggest issue, but the biggest issue I would suggest is that we don't try to make it better. So try to make progress, start somewhere, see what we can do, and then it's learning together as we're getting better in this work. Invite diverse voices in your design team is another one that can be really helpful, is inviting people to share their knowledge and their experiences and how we may be limited in what we see and assume is true. So inviting those diverse voices is recommended. Check who's not participating and why. If you look at your programs, typically, do you always see similar people, or do you hear similar comments, or do you sometimes feel that you're missing out on knowledge that's out there? And why is that? What's happening in the design process or in the access that people are not part of what you're aiming to do? And finally, evaluate your program. So maybe the questions can help you to start at the end. Evaluate your programs, ask feedback, understand where some of the issues are, and then start working back to, hey, how can I do this differently? So I'm really curious to hear later on what your thoughts are on this. But this was kind of my sharing piece for today. Next week's going to be about, working together and coming up with more ideas on what we can do. My contact details if you want to get in touch. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm definitely going to stop recording. Yeah, I have stopped